All right, we're back. Took a little hiatus for December with podcasts. Me and Mike were trying to be on it really good with doing these regularly, and then it fell down. So sorry to our one regular listener. Hopefully we'll get some more. But yeah, we're going to chat today back about strength training, really, and specifically some of the methods we use around strength training for CrossFit, how it applies to different people from like a traditional standpoint of strength training, and then, how we use different methods to train different calibers of athletes as well, and have some takeaways for people moving forward. So first off, new host, new guest, Harry.
Mike's been replaced.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he wasn't cutting it. Another owner of AOD and coached too many people, and very strong. I would give you the semi title of like AOD head strength coach. I think that would be like the route we could go down. If you're happy with that,
I'll take that.
I'll take that. No, bro. So yeah, I think it was good for us to do a little bit of a strength podcast after the other stuff me and Mike talked about in terms of periodization and planning, because I think it is just quite a hot topic at the moment, especially with different things you see obviously prevalent around Instagram, what people try and different things people do, and because it's always, again, a fundamental element that people, I think, get wrong and struggle to do when they are trying to train for CrossFit at a high level, right?
Yeah, I think there's, in terms of strength training, if you're looking at a top level as well, or just strength in general, I think there's two very like recognizable, almost like spikes where post-COVID, there was just like this huge dramatic increase in strength levels, just like across the board. And it's more so than anything probably comes down to people actually just didn't compete as much. So they had like an off season, if you want to call it that, forced off season. And then the other kind of like very clear thing is that this season, there's just been some absolutely mad numbers going up, whether it be at WFP, whether it's the back squats that they did at the games, like even if you bring it down to like people's heavy Isabel times, like I think the level of everything is always going up, but this year, it's gotten pretty crazy, and I think it's interesting because people haven't been forced to take an off season. They are competing more than they have ever. So the methods and how people are going about it is obviously changing as well, rather than it just being like compete less and do like squats 3 times a week. There's obviously a different way around this.
No, exactly that, right? Even like, say 5-6 years ago, you'd have been like, oh, if you can snatch 120, 125, sounds, you don't really need to get much stronger as a guy. If you're a girl and you can snatch like 80, you're doing well. And now it's like you're literally coming last at an elite level competition with those numbers, right?
Yeah, so, pretty much. Because even I'd be really interested to see like a max lift like that just at like a semi-finals, because obviously WFP like probably isn't quite the CrossFit Games. There's a lot of the same people, but it's a semi-finals is quite representative of like a more realistic pool, right? Because there's games athletes there and there's elite athletes within their region or whatever. So I'd be interested to see how it trickles down as well, and what the kind of normative data is, because you've always got those freaks, but then the gap between the freaks and everyone else is getting smaller. So
it's closing. Yeah, it's definitely closing. I think that's kind of a good place to start, right? Before we delve into all these different things. We always use data as much as we can in our program and the way we train, and now definitely over like the last season, when you look at that like normative data for us, where do you think those numbers are now? If you're like categorizing people as being like, right, we've got to get you stronger, where does it go from like that quarterfinal level, if you will, like more like regional and local competitions, semi-final level and elite level? Because definitely like my concept of what was strong enough has definitely changed. But then also at the same time, you don't need to be snatching 145, but no. It's like, because at the end of the day, it's very, you can call it what you want, but CrossFit is probably the root of an endurance sport more than anything, but still you need to have those prerequisites, right? Where do you think those numbers lie, like based on this last season? Have you kind of changed your thoughts about that?
I think it comes down to what people can hit as like an everyday max, like what can they walk into the gym and reliably hit? Because I think the reason a lot of these people are hitting these massive PRs at competition is because the weights they can hit on a regular basis, like the threshold's moving up, because everyone will always kind of talk about that one lifetime PR as their thing, but then a competition comes around and they're not even within like 5 to 10 kilos of it or whatever. So I think the numbers that athletes need to be able to kind of walk in the gym and be like, I can comfortably hit this and I know I'm going to hit it, has definitely crept up. And for like someone who wants to go to semi-finals, like I don't even know what bottom end would be like, because it's all about the strength workouts are all about, like, for weaker people it's like damage limitation, but then if you're going to come last in a workout, your weekend's probably pretty much cooked unless you're exceptionally good at other stuff.
It was like how low is too low, right? Like, where can you? Yeah.
And I would potentially argue that maybe only females can get away with that because they generally have more spread in the workouts, whereas the guys, you definitely can't get away with that. Like, and more than often, the people that you see have the big disparities in their scores on the guys' side are actually the strong ones who do really well in the power output and strength, and then their kind of like longer stuff or gymnastics is maybe a bit worse. So I don't think anyone, especially male athletes, can afford to be like, oh, I'll just take like a bottom placing on this. Categorizing athletes into levels, like, it seems like to be competitive at like a CrossFit Games, what, like, I say competitive, for it to be a normal kind of score, it's like 135 and north of that for a snatch. And then maybe if we're talking semi-finals, it's probably 125 to be in the well, you're at Lowlands, right? Like, that was kind of a little bit below semi-finals, but there's a lot of semi-finals athletes there. Like, what was a relatively middle of the pack score? If
you were hit at Lowlands, that was a kind of a, like I say, a lower level like just below semi-finals. If you hit over 120, you were like top 15ish.
Yeah.
Whereas like if you were hitting 120 at semis, you're bottom 5 to bottom 10, right? So for my guys and girls that are around that level of trying to qualify for semis and semis level, snatch, I'm saying, like, for a guy, the goal is to be able to hit, the minimum is absolutely minimum 120, but it's like we need to be able to hit like a 125 and above, so then you're not taking like last places, right? Like, if we're not at 125, it's like we need to prioritize strength. Yeah. Right, on a snatch,
and
on a
kind
clean
of like
jerk.
that weight, that weight that you can walk in the gym and hit, right?
Exactly. You need
the 120, yeah.
And that clean jerk, I think, is probably harder because I think you've just seen it less, like, together in competitions. But I'd say for a guy, it's now like really like if you're not hitting 150 on a clean and jerk, right? It's like we need to again tap in and put work into like a 150. Maybe even needs to be a little bit more. Girls' side, probably snatch. I like I say, I think the girls can probably get away with it more. But I think on a girls' side, if you're not hitting 75, there's no way you're competing. It needs to be, and for them it's like 80. So if you've not got an 80 kilo snatch, then work needs to be done on your snatch, ideally more. And clean and jerk, it needs to now be like 95 is the very bottom end you can kind of get away with again, but 100's got to be the kind of the minimum that you're aiming for, right, on those numbers.
Yeah,
I would say.
And then everything, if we're talking like compounds, we haven't seen a deadlift in a long time, and I think there can be a big spread in that. But people back squatting, like, if you want to be competitive at a close to semi-finals level or semi-final, it's like you got to be able to back squat over 200, right, with a daily max of like 200. And then on the girls, it's probably 135 to 140 as like a daily max, like, to even, and that's not getting a good score, right? That's just turning up.
There is a massive, because it's not tested. There's such a big disparity, I think, on the girls. You can have girls who are so strong and put up ridiculous scores of the workouts, and yet their fucking back squat is at like 120, and you're just like, how would you? Girls could get away with it so much more, right? But no, I think that's interesting what you're saying about how people kind of like used to train with like the off season. I'm gonna train. I'm gonna get to this point where I do an absolute 1 rep max at the end of the 16-week cycle. I'm gonna hit this sweet PR. And then what? I'm just going to live off of that for the next 6 months while I then go into season. And like, what are you going to do? Because that definitely is kind of how it used to be. And I think there's still a place for that. If someone's strength limitations are really, really far behind, they need to kind of just spend a massive amount off season and like time in a big strength block, if you will. But I think definitely once you get into a season and once you get to a better level of athlete, it's much more important, like I say, the daily maxes that you can go and hit every now and again, because there's no point spending 16 weeks hitting a PR and then, like you say, comes with competition, I'm 10, 15 kilos off of it, right? And I think that's where CrossFit in its sense is, you need to be able to train like concurrently all year round and maintain that strength numbers, and then it's how you go about doing that, right? So before we kind of delve into that, do you still have people that you like, this person is exceptionally on the weak side, I need to fully go into like doing like, more of like a simple linear progression of like a strength block? Or do you kind of like shy away from that completely now.
Yeah, because I think that what the listeners and what people need to understand is that if you have like an off season where the majority of your like energy currency and recovery is spent on strength training, if that gets you a certain result, you're not going to be able to achieve that result or surpass it unless you do the same thing or more. So that big strength cycle off-season peak, you hit that sweet PR at the end of it. When you then get into like more sport training, CrossFit kind of stuff, your number's just going to drop off the face of the earth because you're not giving your body what it needs in order to like facilitate that. So with regards to athletes that have different balances, I think I'd actually typically use the same kind of structure for everyone, but it's just how much of that energy currency needs to be spent in the strength training. And you've got to look at it from this standpoint, in the sense that if someone's got such a glaring weakness in their strength and like their other qualities and like scores are much higher, you can afford to spend the time in the strength, because more than likely, and we know this from just coaching a lot of people over time, is that if they improve their strength, a lot of their strengths will actually improve as well. The same way that like you take a very strength and power based athlete, generally, if you improve those areas, like say it's economy or their aerobic fitness, those things they were already good at actually get better because there's more infrastructure to like facilitate that. So I think there's very niche examples of when you would push so much time into it, but you can normally justify it because of how their scores and their abilities kind of weigh up, I would say.
Yeah, it might just maybe look different in the actual how, not to use the word complicated, but how like complex you get with movements versus like, so say take for instance someone who is, I don't know, their training age is so small, or they're a teen athlete or something, right? You're probably going to be, okay, our goal over the next year or whatever it is to make sure that base is really, really solid before we get into all the complicated stuff, right? And worry about adding all these extra, special strength exercises. It's like you need to just spend time getting comfortable with movements, building a really solid base before we go into all the flashy stuff, if you will, that you see on people doing on Instagram all the time.
Yeah, there's an untapped well, right, where it's just like if they just do, because also by that point you probably won't be at, like, if someone's a relatively beginner or early into it, even if they're really good at certain stuff because of their background, they just need exposure to things. So you don't need to layer in complexity and novelty. You just need to like get them to do the thing. Once they've kind of tapped that out, then you obviously start layering in those additional elements, which we will talk about.
yeah, exactly, right. So I guess when you look at, previously when it comes to CrossFit, people would be like, right, I'm going to do like you say, off season, they'd go, I'm just going to do a really simple, like linear progression. I'm going to follow something like fucking Wendler or like a 5x5 or like something just round, do that, get to the end of the cycle, chuck in probably like a Catalyst weightlifting program, because why not? Everyone's done that as well, right? Get to that point where it's like, right, I'm doing this strength training, or this powerlifting program, I'm doing this weightlifting program. I get to the end, I PR my numbers, I then go into a CrossFit phase and I see those numbers drop off. Bridging that gap from doing that, like doing the strength work, to being able to perform in the CrossFit is niche, because it is just like I guess because CrossFit is generally so under-researched, people didn't know the best way to do it, right? They didn't know the methods that would work, and they didn't know how to bridge that gap. And I think you still see people making those mistakes now. Someone like, even like high-level athletes do 6, 12-week like weightlifting cycles, and you're just watching it and you're just like, this is great. I'm sure your numbers will go up, but unless you're training for a weightlifting meet, it's probably not going to have any impact on your actual performance at the end of the day, right? When you get to competition. So I guess what kind of led you specifically, I guess, to try and like delve into, okay, there's other ways to do this and there's better ways to do it. So yeah, well, what kind of like led you down that route, and where'd you go for that research and like learning about it, I guess?
Yeah, so obviously what we're kind of alluding to is that the conjugate method, or just like concurrent strength training, is going to be the kind of well, in my opinion, in our opinion currently, like that is the most valid and viable way to train athletes. And really it's something that's developed over time, in the sense that as developing as coaches, we would have explored every single avenue, whether it be traditional like periodization with accumulation phases, like transmutation, realization kind of stuff. Also concurrent training methods with Conjugate falling within that bracket as well. And it's just kind of like tailed down over time. And I think over the years, like say like 4 or 5 years ago, I would have had all these methods at my disposal. I'm using all of them with different people at different times. And then as time goes on, I'm like, well, the ones that are more effective are the ones that are staying. And I'm just kind of like tapering down the amount of stuff that I will then apply. And I think, like you're talking about, people doing strength programs and weightlifting programs, it's like, that is not designed for the CrossFit athlete. That is designed for strength athletes who all of their energy and recovery, like resources, are just put into them getting stronger, with no consideration for other qualities and the sport that you need to develop it for. So I think it's a major red flag when people are like, yeah, time to get really strong and like, I'm going to bump this up and do whatever, because it's like, it doesn't really work like that. It's consistency over time, and you need to find the thing that's going to allow you to get these consistent results over time. And we all know that progress isn't linear. So you need to apply that pressure consistently, and then you'll obviously have these breakthrough moments and these times that, because you've been patient, it really jumps up. The amount of times, especially in my early days of coaching, when you would apply some kind of strength, whatever, template or program, and at the end of it, sometimes people don't even PR. They're like better at squatting or whatever it is, but they won't hit the PR because, like, especially for more experienced athletes, progress is not just linear, and then they'll PR like 6 months later because they've done all that work earlier on or something. But I think people need to find what is going to be the most consistent and the most manageable, that is also going to complement their sport training the most, basically.
Yeah, allow you to have room to do not just the strength work, but everything else in line with it, right? And oftentimes when you have just a straight strength program or straight limit lifting program, it just doesn't allow for any of that additional stuff in there. And like you said, it's definitely happened so many times, like, you know, having program people just normal strength blocks. Like you say, they get way stronger in whatever you're programming for them. Oh, the week comes around and they get a little bit ill, or their sleep's a little bit off, and it's like, oh, I'm now not PR'd. So now what have we wasted those last 12 weeks? So it's like, no, but at the same time, you know, people put their whole hopes on hitting a PR over 1 week, like a big test week, and then it doesn't go well, and that can have so much negative carryover, opposed to being like, well, you have got stronger. Like I said, the goal of CrossFit is not your performance on any one random given week. It's, especially with how the season looks now, you've got so many competitions over the course of, 3-6 months. It's being able to perform and maintain those strength numbers over the course of that. And I think definitely that has changed in the last few years with, like you say, post-COVID, more competitions coming up, the need for there to be more than like one peak in a season, one peak in someone's year, right? It's not now just about the CrossFit Games or just about that. It's like, no, you're trying to do 4 competitions. How are you going to best be prepared for all of that? And I think definitely, like I say, a conjugate style and a daily undulating periodization style of strength training, but also just from like a general CrossFit standpoint as well, you could apply it the same way to energy system training, right? Like just doing, oh, I'm going to do 12 weeks of just running to try and PR my 5K or whatever it is again, not going to have the best outcome when you look at what you're trying to do when you compete in a sport, right? So for those people that don't know then, and I guess from a standpoint of like traditional West Side barbell conjugate method to then where it is now and how we kind of apply it to CrossFit, you kind of want to explain it like as minimally and as basic as you can.
I'll try and give it, because there's obviously, and the reason it's taken me so long to be like, this is using the conjugate method is probably one of the most viable methods. It's taken me like 4 or 5 years to get there. So there's obviously a lot of complexity and layers to it. But effectively, what it comes down to is 3 like main methods as in the base of it. And it is going to be the maximum effort method, the dynamic effort method, and then the repeated or repetition effort method. And each of those are looking to hit different qualities within kind of an athlete's like strength profile. So the maximum effort method is basically looking to increase absolute strength. And the major kind of parameters for this are that you are just lifting under a very, very high strain, like RPE 9 to 10. You're never hitting true failure because you're training. So you're always kind of holding a little bit back, but you're looking to really push heavy weights, which typically looks like 93% plus as being like a sweet spot. And this is often done in singles, doubles, triples, whatever that be. Then you've got your dynamic effort method, which is going to be basically moving sub-maximal lighter weights with maximal intent and velocity. And this is going to improve an athlete's rate of force development, so how quickly they can move loads. This is a less stressful method that has nice carryover into other ways of applying force, which is why it's quite well utilized. It's also very specifically closely tied to like the kind of velocities you'd see in like weightlifting as well, which is why it kind of carries over nice into that. And then you've got the repeated effort, or the repetition effort method, which is effectively looking to elicit the kind of mechanisms of hypertrophy through higher rep work. And this is a little bit more kind of expanded in the sense that you could be targeting a specific muscle group for hypertrophy. You could be targeting a specific muscle group for muscular endurance. You could be targeting a muscle group for like, not a muscle group necessarily, like a joint for like soft tissue training, but it's effectively trying to utilize high volume and high repetition. So you've got 3 very different like methods, and then you're going to organize them into your week. And that will look like a max effort lower day. You'll then have like 48 hours before you hit another max effort, a max effort upper day. Then towards the tail end of the week, you'll either have 2 dynamic days, an upper and a lower, or you might have like a combined dynamic day, which is something that's newer that Westside have developed since they've worked with more athletes, just to save more time so the athletes have more time to work on their sport. And then where the repetition effort kind of falls into this is both of those sessions, you'll hit your max or your dynamic effort, and then it will lead into repetition effort work, which you're going to use special exercises, which are variations of movements targeting certain weak areas that the athlete needs to be working on. And that's your kind of weekly structure. And then you'll typically work in 3-week waves, so that you basically progress loading or volume or whatever it is, like in a more traditional sense, so progressive overload, for 3 weeks. And then at the 3-week point, that is when your body's started to accommodate the stimulus that you've been providing it. So you need to rotate and change variations or stimuluses, and then you kind of rinse and repeat. And the idea is that deloads aren't built into this, and you'll only ever really deload when the athlete has the need for deloading because of excessive fatigue or soreness or whatever. But because of the constant changing in just like stimulus or joint angles or movements, you're never necessarily hitting a point of overuse or kind of overreaching too much, which means that across an entire year, you can actually apply a lot of pressure in terms of improving and changing things. So that's kind of a very brief overview. There's obviously a lot more layers to it if we're talking about exercise variation, accommodative resistance, whatever. But that is the concurrent structure of the conjugate method.
Yeah, you can go to, like you say, you can go into so much detail because there's so many things to talk about there, just like as you're breaking it all down. But I think, yeah, a couple of things you pointed out there, which is really good, is obviously, like I say, if you can get a whole year in, obviously there's different phases you can go through a training, but if you get a whole year in without having to take as structured deloads every 4, 5 or 6 weeks, like you would with the more traditional, strength program, again, it's just kind of stacking more hours that you can do more work, right? And get better with. I think a couple of things that I've kind of played around with and get your opinion on is, like you say, working in these 3-week waves, right? Like you say, the goal is to, through those, build the stress adaptation that you get across those 3 weeks before you change the stimulus. Now, you go classic like Westside, when the conjugate was, you would change that max effort, upper, lower, all that every single week, right? You'd vary it massively. I personally think from like a CrossFit perspective, because of the nature of athletes being a little bit, they're not specialized strength athletes, you can get better results oftentimes, or at least allow people to adapt a little bit better because they need slightly more exposure to certain movements by keeping in similar movements for those 3 weeks. So for instance, like with max effort example, my max effort lower week 1, I'm going to do a back squat. It's going to be a heavy 3. I'm going to keep with the back squat into week 2, but it's going to be a heavy 2. I'm going to keep with the back squat into week 3. It's going to be a heavy 1, right? So you still kind of have that slight linear progression with it. That's just like the most basic example. But you're not then changing the variation of the squat every single week, because that novelty of movements, especially once you start getting a bit more complex with them, say you're doing more like combinative resistance stuff, or, just variations that people have never used, bars that people have never used, there's kind of that element of people
not having
a little bit of maybe fear about the movement. Like that first session they do it, they build to their heavy 1 or whatever it is, and you're like, what the fuck are you doing? That was like so far off of where it should be because it's taken you so long to get there, right?
But they're like, I'm doing a wide stance low box squat, like my hips felt like they were going to explode kind of thing. And it's like, not used to it. That's a very, very valid shortcoming. But I also have a rebuttal for that. Is basically, when I think that's a really good place to start when people are being introduced to the conjugate method or training in that way, because too much variety, like you said, they'll never get the good stimulus. Whereas once someone's been in the system for like, I probably, because I've obviously been training this way for a fair bit of time, but I would probably say it takes 8 months to a year to then have the same variations that you've hit before come back around, and you be familiar enough with them that you can then be like, I'm going for a 2.5 kilo PR. I'm going for a 5 kilo PR. And then that is your very obvious indicator of progress, but you have to be in the system for long enough to start reaping the benefit of that. So I think from a starting point, like having, even doing something like, having your max effort for 3 weeks being like back squat waves, but it's like a 6-4-2, and you just want those waves to get heavier each week, and you want the strain to be really high, so you get the high threshold motor unit recruitment. I'm like, I think that's really good. And then obviously you rotate it the next wave or whatever, but then once you've been doing that for long enough, you can just rotate the exercise every week because the athlete's covered most of the exercises you should be using. And when we're looking at max effort exercise selection, you only really want like 2 degrees of separation from the main exercise that you're trying to get into. Now, CrossFit isn't powerlifting. They've got 3 main exercises in powerlifting, so it's easy to do that. But for CrossFit, it's basically a squat, so front squat, back squat, a deadlift, and then bench press or strict press. So when you're prescribing these variations for max effort sessions, it's like, what am I going to change here? So if you were going to do a box squat, that's 1 degree of separation. That's perfect, right? And you never really have to get overly complicated with these things. And I think when people think of the conjugate method, they think, sweet, I'll max out every week and they'll always miss their top single. And sweet, I'll start doing some really, really random shit. And like, you just totally miss the stimulus completely. So that's one thing. But then also, I think what I'll explain to people is that in terms of the 3-week wave, with your repetition effort work and like your accessories or any special exercises you might add, you do want a 3-week wave of like linear progression. And that is the same with your dynamic effort work as well. You want a 3-week wave of linear progression, and you typically are just looking to make small tweaks and changes that will hit the weak point within a movement. So say, you are trying to improve your bench press, so that's an area of focus for you, and you always miss just coming off your chest when your pecs are at their kind of like longest range. It's like, I'll put a special strength or a dynamic effort rotation in where I put fat grips on the bar so it increases that range of motion a bit, or you use like a cambered bar so it has a bit of extra, like a bow bar, and you'll do that for 3 weeks, and then you'll find another way to get after that weakness and just like keep rotating it like that. So you're effectively doing the same training wave after wave. There's just very, very minor changes that are never more than 2 steps away from the thing that you're trying to get better at, Like
I say, to make sure you actually get the desired stimulus. I think that's the biggest thing about any training method you use, but especially conjugate when you're trying to hit this, it is I won't use the word pointless to do, but if you're going to do like, I'm going to do a conjugate method, and then all of your max efforts, you're always only going to like a 7 RP and never actually pushing hard enough. Your dynamic work, you're always just kind of going through the motions. You're never actually moving with intent and moving with speed, or even like your repetition method stuff. If you're never pushing close enough to like failure and reps in reserve, you're kind of missing the stimulus on all of those things, right? So that's where it's really important to understand. And this goes for anything, like, why are you doing what you're doing, and what should it feel like, and what should you try and get out of it? And people will still always make those mistakes, especially at the start of a training program. But it's kind of then like, as a coach, giving that feedback and being like, calling people out, being like, well, no, you've just not pushed hard enough on this, right? You need to get to this point. It should feel like this. So make sure that people don't take 3 weeks to get into actually feeling that stimulus, and they've just wasted those first 2 weeks of a phase.
And that's why the coaching is so important, in terms of making sure that the stimulus is hit correctly. And then also in terms of exercise selection, is this the best? Like, I'm not just like chat GPT in a load of back squat variations and slapping them in. It's like, what are the squat variations that are going to hit this person's limiter the most? So like, say you've got someone who's a very, very quad dominant athlete, you're going to want to start to work on variations that build their hips more. So wide stance box squats, like potentially like low bar, like using specialty bars that are going to load their hips more than them just being able to just shoot their knees forward. And that's where the coach's eye comes in super, super important. And also, like, with your dynamic effort work, there's certain velocities that you need to be hitting. Not everyone has access to velocity-based training devices. So it's very important for a coach to be able to recognize if the intent's there, but also if the load that they're prescribing is going to be achieving the correct stimulus with that. Something I would actually like to cover is, because we're talking about how to get stronger and all these compounds, things like this, and it's kind of, and everyone, all they care about is weightlifting. It's far too much, I think. But is, where does Olympic weightlifting kind of fit into the equation here? Because we're talking about getting stronger, right, and making the body stronger, but we're not talking about Olympic weightlifting.
No, agreed. I think that's, and that again is where you've just explained really well as well, like conjugate method in its sense, but then it's like, right, how do we then change that and apply it more to CrossFit, right? And making like the athlete's needs, one of those is obviously that. But then the other ways are, right, where does your muscle endurance training, where does your gymnastics come into that? Where does your weightlifting come into that? Because all of that can be applied and trained in like a conjugate style, right? And it's just about understanding how and why you do that. So yeah, I guess clear one. Yeah, let's start with the Olympic weightlifting then. Like, so if you are someone maybe not even necessarily has a big weakness, but like you say, needs to get stronger, their numbers aren't quite where they are, this is the route we're going down from like a strength training perspective. And they are the athletes like, yeah, well, doing all my compounds are great, but I'm just straight up, I just don't have big enough snatch. Like, so where do you go to applying that into someone's training, whether it's it adjusts to this or whether it's also extra bits in the week that are like, technical focused?
So your max effort days are never going to like revolve around weightlifting, because the requirements for that, like high threshold motor unit recruitment, that max force production, isn't applicable to weightlifting. It's too fast, right? When you're weightlifting, the bar speed is typically like 0.8 to 0.12 meters per second or something like that. So that actually fits very nicely into dynamic effort training. And I think that something that is really important for CrossFit athletes is kind of, you have to be lifting heavy all the time in terms of your weightlifting. One, because it's quite stressful on your body, but two, like all of your top end strength stuff's getting covered. So then your weightlifting work, typically you want to probably keep it in the 75 to 85% range. And that fits nicely into, firstly, a dynamic day, because that the bar velocities are going to be similar. So you can always work it in there. You can always start your sessions with your weightlifting, but you're not sending it super hard. You're kind of getting good technical reps in, and then you can move into your max effort work or whatever it is for the day. And I'll quite often categorize weightlifting as like skill work. And I try not to completely annihilate athletes with that work until it becomes this very specific thing. When the competition's close, or we're building into a competition, it's like, you need to get those heavier touches. So you'll start working up to heavier weights and getting more familiar with that, or you need to do like battery and just like more weightlifting under fatigue and things like that. And then I'm then categorizing that as like sport specific training. So at no point am I considering like weightlifting as like strength training per se. I'm always kind of putting it in these other brackets because I just think that you can get way better at weightlifting without having to do as much volume as you sometimes see people doing, or like a weightlifting program would recommend. And as CrossFitters, we need to accept that we're not specialists, so our weightlifting is never going to be as good as a weightlifter. Although we might look kind of similar to them and we train in similar places, it's a very different kind of way to do it, I think.
The only, again, caveat I'd push back on that is, again, when you have someone who is so technically inefficient that maybe more time needs to be spent on it, right? But like you say, if someone generally has, they move well, they don't have any glaring weaknesses, right? You can be like, they can snatch, they can clean and jerk, it's fine. Then getting stronger is often the biggest thing that correlates to them hitting bigger snatches and bigger clean and jerks, right? It's not just hammering weightlifting. That weightlifting element is there to, like you say, get more powerful, get faster, and then transfer over the strength training into your Olympic lifts. But you can go, and we've seen it a lot of time, right? People can go friggin' 3 months without doing much weightlifting at all, just doing strength training, come round to then a competition where they have weightlifting and they get close, if not PR, their lifts just for the fact of getting way stronger without touching on it, because they've got that technical foundation. It's just whether you have athletes who are so technically inefficient that maybe more time needs to be spent on that. But then you even covered that, right? Like, it doesn't need to get heavy to do that. You can just spend more time on the movements and really dial in that, at the start of sessions, right?
For that athlete as well, it would be like when you're doing your special exercises, repetition effort work, it's like, do I want to gear this towards improving their weightlifting, or do I want to gear this towards improving their compounds and their like overall body strength? So a lot of technical issues can actually be kind of worked out in their special exercises, but if that's like the major focus, because you're going to get into a lot of those small muscles and that postural stuff that's the issue. So say it's like front racking and keeping posture in their cleans, like an overhead kind of thing. You can get into that with special exercises and accessories. It just means you're going to have to maybe give up some of that work that you might put into like loads of hypertrophy or stuff that's going to support the big lifts. So for someone, you might be able to put so much stuff in their program that looks like they're getting way better at weightlifting. But when they look at it on paper, they're kind of like, well, why haven't I got like 30 minutes of snatch EMOMs to start my session? It's like, yeah, like you don't need to do that much, right, to get there.
Hey, that was a sweet old school way. We just did weightlifting when we started.
Yeah,
just for like 20-minute EMOMs of just, keep building and get heavier and heavier and then hope you get there, right? And sometimes you get that just random adaptations where you just beating your head against the wall because you really want it more than actually.
I also think that, because we're talking about weightlifting, but also gymnastics, right? You mentioned about gymnastics, and one of the really big things for me at the minute is kind of trying to apply more areas of CrossFit. And I think in terms of gymnastics, like if you're looking to train gymnastics movements, especially like more higher skill ones, you're probably looking at like volume work, so how much volume of the movement people can do. You got like density work, and then you could also bracket it into like strength and then also power, because if you improve someone's strength or power through a certain range of motion, the relative energy cost of the movement will then go down. So your dynamic effort days, especially like if we're talking upper body, could suddenly be geared towards gymnastics movements where you're hitting similar movement patterns, but you're trying to improve your rate of force development. Mainly just so you can move faster, you can cycle the reps quicker, but also because you're so much faster, you're holding tension for a lot less time. So then when you then move back to carrying it over into like the density and the volume work, which is more sport specific, there's a lot of benefit there. I would say it probably applies more to like strict handstand push-ups, like legless rope climbs. Like you could probably get away with some like muscle up stuff around that, like more higher loaded gymnastics movements. But there's definitely ways to work that into the structure in the program that works really, really well.
Yeah, like you say, you probably wouldn't be doing dynamic effort upper work of like weighted chest bars and stuff, right? Just because of the issues around it go. But you can definitely apply so many CrossFit like weightlifting elements, gymnastics elements to it. And I think that's again, the pitfall people fall into where they go, right, I'm going to do my gymnastics work just in all my metcons, right? All my training, all my conditioning. So I'm just going to chuck in chest bar, chuck in gymnastics, chuck in legs, rope climb, strict handstand push-ups. And again, they don't get better at those movements necessarily because they don't train them in isolation. And I think when you look at it, at the end of the day, kind of a caveat to what we're saying with all this, you don't need to be doing CrossFit in its classic sense all year round to get better at CrossFit and better at competitions, right? If you're structuring your strength work, your endurance work, and your weight and your gymnastics work into a sensibly written program that incorporates all of these same parameters, you don't need to be doing, a fucking insane CrossFit workout or like past open workouts every single day of the year to get better. You can bring that stuff in when you are 4 to 6 weeks out from a competition. You need to get a lot more sport specific. And if you trained well enough in all those other elements, that have so much carryover into it. It doesn't need to be just beating your head against the wall doing those things throughout the whole year, right? And again, because that's where I think this comes in really importantly, is keeping people away from getting massively burnt out and injured around training. Mm-hmm. Injuries are always going to happen, whether they're just general overuse ones, whether they're just accidental things. But when you are doing those classic, 12 weeks of Olympic weightlifting cycle, it's so easy to start getting people with bad knees, bad wrists, because you're just doing the same movements over and over and over again, trying to just continually add load week on week, even if you're maybe failing and, missing reps. Whereas something like this allows you to have that bit more like, right, you're only going to 70 to 85%. You're changing the variation of movements. You're probably going to be staying a lot further away from pushing yourself to that point of burnout and overreaching that then comes around with like more traditional CrossFit, if you will, right? How people used to kind of train.
And the variety is very important because it's like, it's obviously, we're talking about the old school a bit more, but it's like, like previously, the only reason people would box squat or maybe like sumo deadlift or like they'd do variations is because they have an injury. So they're only sticking to the very specific measures that they see come up in their sport. When it's like 1 or 2 degrees of separation, you're going to get all that carryover. You're going to remove a lot of the kind of potential for overuse injury. And like I was saying earlier about just working weaknesses in generally, if you work weak areas and things that don't feel very good, it will then enhance your strengths further as well because you're just pulling on more stuff. But yeah.
No, agreed. You definitely, obviously, like you say, you've been applying this for a lot longer to yourself because as coaches, again, we end up just playing around with training for ourselves more than other people. Yeah, exactly. Being guinea pigs for athletes. So I guess since you have been training like this, even like for the last year, right, you've probably been more conjugate in your structure of your strength work. What kind of changes have you seen in like just yourself? Have you seen a carryover a lot into your CrossFit, into just generally like when you are maxed out? Because we always used to say, especially for you, someone who is so naturally strong and you do carry that through really well, you try and stay away from maxing out quite often because it can take quite a big toll on your body, right? But like a conjugate style is you're kind of doing the opposite when you are hitting heavy more frequently. But generally, how would you say that kind of like difference has been from more classical strength training to since training more conjugate?
So the structure of my training isn't hugely biased towards like trying to get load stronger. I'm basically playing with what is the bare minimum of like time under pressure of weights and stuff that I can use to get stronger by a small margin relatively. And I would say that using the basic conjugate structure, it's much easier to warm up and it's also much easier to hit like 90% on lifts and it'd be very, very casual, which is nice, but it's because you're just handling those heavier loads and also you can just get into things much faster. So that's necessarily like, that's like the first thing. Another thing is just being way more in tune and way more familiar with where you're at a moment in time. You know if you don't feel good, you know if you feel good, and you just start to learn to be able to negotiate these things. So it's like previously, like you said, I wouldn't do loads of strength training and then I'd maybe top it up prior to a competition. The amount of doubts I'd have in my head, like, shit, can I still do this? Like, is it going to be there because I've not been touching on anything? That completely goes away. What I've actually also kind of done is a lot of CrossFit movements that I'm weaker at, rather than just trying to do more of them, which is a more traditional approach, is like, I'm not very good at this, I'll just add another day of it, or I'll just do more volume, is I'm trying to find ways through special exercises and accessories to work around the movement so that I can not go silly with the sport-specific practice of the movement, so I don't get the overuse injury, and then I enhance it with the special exercises, so whether it be strength work, muscular endurance work, so that I'm putting the volume and the load through those places, and then it carries over really nicely into the sport. So since I've been working this way, like, we obviously all have niggles and little issues with our body, but I've not had any issues that have stopped me from being able to work on weak areas. Whereas, like, you would remember, like, ring muscle ups still aren't a super strong movement for me, but previously it would be like, we're getting somewhere, ring muscle ups are looking pretty good, and then my shoulder would like flare up, and it's like, fuck, what do we do now? And I don't necessarily do more ring muscle ups now than I ever would previously. I just do more work around it, and they seem to be coming on a lot better because of that. So that's kind of the biggest lessons, is you feel way more ready all the time, and also the incidence of like overuse and the ability to be consistent is just so much better.
Yeah, no, for sure. So this kind of brings us on to, obviously, we're from next week basically launching AD Conjugate, for lack of a better name, right? A little like supplementary, well, it's not supplementary, but like additional program to our generic program, right? And I guess when you look at that, that's going to be very much structured around everything we've just spoken about through this podcast. If you're someone who are like, right, I want to get stronger, but I'm still following, a normal CrossFit program, how would you go about applying like a program like this, like 4 days of 2 max effort days, 2 dynamic days? How would you go about adjusting your current training if you can only train 5 days a week right now?
Mm-hmm. So say it were 4 days of training in front of me, like, you can always have a combined dynamic day. So on the combined dynamic day, you basically would just be like, here's my 2 dynamic days of training. What's my priority in the sense of upper body versus kind of like lower body? We did a session on the camp where we did a combined dynamic day, and then I put options for accessories in there, upper or lower. So I would probably sandwich those 2 together potentially, because that works really well, and obviously just prioritize the things that are more important to you. Equally, I had a thought in my head, it's literally just gone, is quite often it's assessing the nature of a workout. So with athletes that I'm not pushing their strength as much, or time crunched athletes, their special exercises might actually be in the form of strength endurance work, or maybe a metcon that has quite a high like muscular load. So the bottleneck's more to do with the musculature that we're trying to train that day. So replacing some special exercises with that more muscularly loaded kind of like metcon or strength endurance work can help you get your time down in terms of that. Obviously, if you have all the time in the world to train, or strength is the huge priority, then you want to kind of prioritize the strength work more. And because you're prioritizing it in this method, you can kind of rely on the fact that things that you're probably missing out on a little bit are still going to be improving, because you're covering so many bases, like whether it's maximal strength, like dynamic effort, like rate of force development, you're getting lots of muscular endurance adaptations from special exercises and accessories, and your body's probably going to feel a lot more healthy for it as well. That would kind of be some of my key bases. And when I work with athletes one-to-one that are time crunched, it's all about trying to hit all the right stuff without just writing loads of training, basically.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point on that. Like, you don't always need to be doing the movement to be getting better at a movement, right? Especially if you are prioritizing the weak areas for you. Like strict handstand push-ups are a really good example, right? People are always like, oh, I'm bad at them, I need to be doing them 3-4 times a week. Whereas like, well, actually, if you just have some dedicated weakness work around what is your limiter on a strict handstand push-up, oftentimes that can move the needle just as much as doing endless volume, but it's not then beating up your wrists, beating up your shoulders. Or,
so like a really good example is someone who's time crunched. They hit their strict handstand push-up practice in the week. They then need to combine their dynamic effort day. Make sure you can obviously hit the pulls and the squats, but hit the upper body piece. Do the upper body accessories, and it's like you've got 2 days a week where you're training strict handstands, although you're not actually doing the strict handstands on one of them. Rather than just being like, I'll just bang in another 10-minute EMOM of like 6 strict handstands a minute. It's like, you're just doing more of the same stuff. It's kind of pointless. So that's like a really good example, and any athlete with any limitation can look at it from that standpoint and try and understand the carryover.
No, totally. Well, if anyone out there is keen to get stronger, AD Conjugate launching on Monday. Come join. Have fun with it.
Yeah, I'm very excited for this.
Yeah, it'll be sweet. I guess, yeah, so wrapping up, moving forward, at WFP, you obviously saw some fucking monster snatches on both the guys and girls side. Do you think that, and not like Tudor Magda hit, what did he hit at 147? Something mad?
151, I think.
151, there you go, right?
I think D hit 152.
And Tudor Magda trains Conjugate, right? Like his strength work is around Conjugate. Like, so do you think more, I definitely think in the last year from what you've seen on Instagram, you can tell a lot more people are doing this now. A lot more people are training this way. Do you think that's going to continue? Do you think we're going to keep seeing those numbers fucking continue to increase next year? People are going to be banging at 160 in a couple of years' time?
Like, what I will say, and I did kind of say this at the start, is that I think that the really freaky people are maybe kind of touching on the precipice of like what's possible to be to be fit enough to be at the top level and be that strong. I think so. Like Guy, he's, I don't want to say clinging on because he's just done really well at WFP, but he can sometimes not do that well at these really elite competitions, and he's like a freaky guy. I think the gap between the rest of the field and the freaky people will really start to close, and that will be the most noticeable difference. Rather than the freaky numbers keep going up, they will. Like, there was multiple girls that snatched over 100 as well. It's like it's ridiculous. But I think maybe Conjugate training, it's not like in this super. It probably will go into a big hype cycle pretty soon, but we only really recognize it because we understand. And obviously we communicate with the coaches and the athletes a little bit more, so we kind of see a little bit more of that. I just know that because of the layers to this system, it takes a long time to become familiar with it and learn how it works well and things like that. So I would be reluctant. Like, if every coach was just started being like, yeah, we do Conjugate, it's the only way, I'd kind of just think like, is it going to be that effective? I don't know. Like, it's all about the layers and doing it in the right way. And
like everyone else, right? Like every other you can't just slap a random, let's just go find like a West Side Conjugate. I'm sure there's ones out there, right? You could probably download like a fucking 12 months of Conjugate from West Side and just like, you can't just put it into someone's program and expect them to get the results, right?
But I've been there, and that's where I started in terms of like learning about it. And at that point, I was just like, I don't think this is that good relative to more traditional like periodization methods, because I feel like traditional periodization is like way safer because it's so linear and easy. But then, like I said, if the system's being applied well, once you've been in the system for 6 months, 8 months, 12 months, it all starts coming back around. And like, I had a max effort lower this week. It was like a 1 rep max cambered bar back squat. I was like, right, I need to hit 195 today. I'm pretty nervous about this because like I PR'd that probably like 4 months ago, and then I just like air squatted it, and then I hit 200 after that as well, really, really easy as well. And it's now at this point that when the lifts come back around, I'm really, really confident to PR those. And then sometimes the conventional lift that people actually talk about, like your bench, your squat, your deadlift, when that comes back around, like you PR that again. So I think the people that apply it well and the people that have been in the system consistently for a long time, not Danielle Brandon because she jumps coaches every 4 months, they are going to start getting some pretty insane results. And
if she holds on now with what Jessie
Bufano,
give it another 9 months, maybe she'll actually.
But look at Justin. Like he's been working with Jessie for so long, but no one I think he probably started working with him after that games that was on the ranch.
It's been like a good 3-4 years.
Yeah, and it just stayed under the surface. And then because he'd been in the system for long enough, like 2 years, whatever, he's now relevant, like more relevant in strength events that were originally holding him back. And people are like, oh, what's he doing? Like, oh, he's doing conjugate, like this, that, and the other. But it's like, yeah, but he's been in the system for a long time, and now he's reaping the reward because of just how consistent and how obviously well that's been delivered for him.
Yeah, for sure. We could keep going, and I'm sure there's loads more we could talk about. But do you think people obviously, would want to, the one thing we haven't kind of touched on is how all that accommodating resistance stuff comes into it around like bands, chains, all that jazz. I think that's kind of the stuff that we said people can get so caught up in. And I'm sure when that like hype cycle comes around, that's what people will focus on so much more. And I use bands and stuff around people's training for sure, but I definitely don't think that's not like, oh, I need to be doing that to be training conjugate. I need to be chucking that into every single lift I'm doing. Like, again, knowing how and when that applies to different people is going to be important. And the same goes for like VBT devices, right? See people using like measuring every single lift they do on a dynamic day. And it's like, again, has its place and it can be useful, but it's like, don't get caught up in the very like niche parts of it. It's like focus on the whole, on
the overarching principles, right? Because when I first got into conjugate as being like, this is the system I'm going to use, I used bands, and then pretty quickly, me using my coach's judgment, I was like, this is ruining the session. Like this session would be better without the bands. So I don't get the benefits of accommodative resistance, but I'm training quicker, so I can do more training in other places. I don't have to worry about the faff and measuring band tensions and things like that. So it is the big three, and then obviously organizing it in a sensible way. You can do it the West Side way, or you can do it a daily undulating, however. But it's those big overarching principles and those qualities you're trying to hit that are going to be the biggest thing here, really.
Yeah, I'd say wait to all those extra little niche bits. Wait until you've got a coach to help you with that instead of just chucking it all in just for the fun of it, right? Yeah, just that's good. Okay, Brill, we'll wrap up there. Kept under an hour. Let's go. I'm sure we'll get you back on very quickly.
I mean, we can cover the velocities, specific special exercises for certain weaknesses, like accommodative resistance, like all that stuff, right, on a different one. But we're just trying to introduce these concepts here so that we've got it on record, so we can then have license.
Or
to
you
do
can
some mad
contact
stuff.
us and get coached by AOD.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe we'll keep them secret. Yeah.
No, Brill. Okay, all good. Well, thanks for joining. Thanks for listening, people. Hope you learned something about some sweet strength training. And if you want to get stronger, join AOD Conjugate starting on the 5th, Monday. I think it's the 5th. Sweet.
Let's go.